Hey people, welcome to the Run Test. It's Kieran here. You guys asked, we are going to answer. In this video, we're going to be comparing two hugely popular shoes, the ASICS Novablast 3 and the Saucony Endorphin Speed 3. Now both of those shoes saw some pretty big upgrades from version 2 to version 3. We've been out there testing them, and in this video we're going to reveal whether or not we think those upgrades have worked, whether they're a better ride than their older generations. Also look at how they compare to each other and reveal which one of those we think is the best bet daily trainer for your money. Quick look at the key details then. When it comes to drop, there's nothing to choose here. Both of them have an 8mm drop. For the Speed, we're getting a stack height of 36mm in the heel, 28mm in the forefoot. With the Novablast, it's 31mm in the rear, 23mm in the forefoot. Weight-wise, the Novablast 3 has a little bit more heft. It comes in at 8.9 ounces or 253 grams. That's up against the Speed 3, which is 8.1 ounces or 229 grams. Price-wise, though, Novablast kind of edges it here. You're going to pay £135 in the UK for the Novablast 3, $140 in the US. The Speed 3 is a little more expensive at £165 and $170. Let's dive into a few of the design highlights then. With the Novablast 3, you've got new midsole foam in this third generation. It's now using Flight Foam Blast Plus cushioning. You've got a slightly higher midsole stack with that too than the Generation 2. But in addition to making for a bouncier ride, that new lighter foam still means that Novablast 3 is 30 grams lighter than the previous version, the Novablast 2. Up top, you've got pretty dense mesh uppers. You've got a big padded heel collar. You've got overlays in the heel for added hold and stability. And you've got strategically placed AHA rubber on the outsole for grip and reinforcements. Moving on to the Speed 3 then. Well, this one, you've got Power Run PB foam. You've got a slightly wider forefoot base than you saw with the Generation 2. You've also still got an S-curve winged nylon plate, but that's also been tweaked to give you extra wings there, to give you a little bit of extra added stability against the 2. Up top, you've got some lighter sort of mesh uppers. There's a little bit more breathable than on the Novablast 3. And over on the outside, you've got XT900 rubber outsole, also strategically placed, so not a full covering here. It's been very, very sparingly used. So I wanted to do a quick kind of side-by-side whip round so you can see the key differences of these shoes. Now the first thing I wanted to talk about is the Novablast 3. It's a noticeably longer shoe in the toe. It comes up longer than the Speed 3. I think a lot of that is to do with this kind of larger heel protrusion that comes out of the back of the Novablast 3. And overall, when you look down on the top of the shoes, the whole kind of base of this foam, the way it kind of protrudes out, makes it feel like there's a lot more kind of shoe on the foot. The widths though, across the midfoot are pretty much similar. But when it comes down into the kind of across the top with the uppers, I think the Novablast 3 is slightly narrower in the midfoot and down into the toe box than you're going to get with the Speed 3. Now, as we mentioned as well earlier on, the mesh upper on the Novablast 3 is much more dense. It's much more structured. There's much more to it than on the Speed 3, which it's got more kind of perforations in it. It just feels a little bit more sort of loose and flexible, and I think overall that makes for a slightly more kind of breathable feel to the uppers. Another clear difference here around the uppers is into the collar, the heel collar. There's much, much more padding all the way down and around the kind of heel collar, even in the sort of forward ankle areas than you'll find on the Speed 3. The Speed 3 is still sort of fairly cushioned and fairly kind of well padded, considering it's a kind of faster sort of shoe, but this is, you know, on the Novablast 3 it's much more considerable, so I guess that overall sort of makes for a slightly more kind of plush, sort of comfortable feeling, but adds a little bit of weight, makes it feel a little bit like there's more shoe on the foot. And both of these shoes have gone for gusseted tongues. The tongue on the Speed 3 is marginally more padded. So flip them over onto the outsole, and yeah, it's hard to gauge whether there's, you know, which one of these has more of the kind of protective outsole rubber. Again, they've both kind of gone for this kind of strategic placement to, I guess, to kind of keep the weight down, put it in the places where you're going to land most for extra added durability. I know this is something with the Speeds that people have found a little bit lacking in terms of the protection of that exposed midsole foam. There's quite a lot of exposed midsole foam on the Novablast 3 here as well. The one sort of major difference, I think, is that the grip here, that AHA kind of rubber grip that you're getting on the Novablast, it's much smoother. There's much less texture. than you find on each of these little areas on the Speed 3, which there's a little bit more texture, and I don't know if that sort of affects grip overall, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. When it came to fit, I ran true to size in both these. In the UK 8.5, that's my normal size. I think in terms of overall fit, they both get really good heel lockdown. I managed to get kind of good hold across the kind of midfoot, the lacing structure there. It's nice and comfortable. I think those kind of tongues wrap nicely, so you can lock down quite nice and tight without worrying about too much pinching. They wrap the foot nicely and make it feel comfortable overall, sort of down into those uppers. I think the one thing you really notice is that maybe the Speed 3 has a little bit more room up top in the width than the Novablast 3, but actually there's a lot more length in the toe box on the Novablast 3. To me, it feels maybe like it's about sort of potentially kind of half a size too big. I would be interested to see how this shoe feels half a size down. Maybe that would also affect how nimble it feels on the foot. But overall, what you're getting on the Novablast 3 is a slightly sort of bigger feel on the foot than you will on the Speed 3. And the Speed 3 feel a little bit more compact overall. So onto the run test then, and I have done a lot more miles in one of these shoes than the other. I've probably done around about 1,000 miles more in the Saucony Endorphin Speed 3, whereas I've done about 50 miles in the ASICS Novablast 3. For both of these, I've done a mixture of terrains. I've done kind of the usual kind of pavements, tarmacs, roads, all that kind of stuff that you would use a road shoe for, but also my usual kind of river paths, compacted kind of stony sort of river paths. So, some even, some uneven across both these shoes. They've both been put through pretty much the same kind of paces as well. A range of kind of slow right up to kind of pelting as fast as I can. So yeah, test them in very sort of similar conditions, even though I've done more miles in one than the other. Now, before we get into it, I have to go full transparency here because I've not been a fan of the ASICS Novablast 1 or 2 up to this point. A couple of reasons. One, I just find that there's been too much shoe on the foot. I like my shoes to feel quite nimble and quite agile and quite compact, and I've always found that there's just a bit of bagginess that goes on with the Novablast 3. I know other people have really loved it though, and I also haven't found the same joy out of the kind of what people describe as that kind of bouncy, energetic, kind of soft but springy kind of ride. I've always found the older models to be a little bit sort of leg sappy and a bit too soft for my liking. I prefer a bit of a firmer shoe. So I was really interested to put the Novablast 3 on and see if the changes they've made to that midsole foam was going to really finally make me a convert. So the first thing I did to compare these two shoes is something that I love to do. Everyone in my area thinks I'm a little bit crazy, but I went out and I ran a mile with the ASICS Novablast 3 on one foot and the Saucony Endorphin Speed 3 on the other foot. So like the absolute crazy I am, I'm out in the park with two different shoes on to test these two up against each other. I've just done a mile laps in the Speed and the Novablast 3, just to get that real sort of comparison. I've got the Novablast on the left, the Speed on the right. And what's really interesting is essentially there's not an awful lot to choose from that mile across all of the categories in terms of kind of stability, in terms of punch, in terms of kind of response. It's minimal, we're talking about kind of small margins here, I think, with these two shoes. What I will say is I think that the Novablast from this mile feel like they're ever so slightly softer. The Speed 3 are a bit firmer. I think you get more of a roll from the Speed 3 than you do from the Novablast. A lot of it comes down to, I think, the length of the Novablast, which to me just feel too long. I much prefer the slightly more compact run and ride and nature of the Speed 3 over the Novablast. I think that compactness just makes you kind of roll through your steps a bit more. It's such a big shoe, the Novablast, that it just feels like it's not rolling through the action quite as quickly. I don't think there's much to choose in terms of the overall bounciness. Maybe the Novablast 3 slightly more sapping than the Speed 3, but the Novablast 3 massive improvement on the 2. In terms of kind of how they hug the foot, there's a bit roomy. They're both kind of roomy. I would say the Novablast 3 a little bit too long, given that kind of mile kind of side-by-side test. Other than that, I think there's very little to choose from. Interesting, I could have run on quite happily wearing these two different shoes and not sense too much difference in them. It's not like you're wearing two wildly different shoes, apart from kind of the length and the kind of boaty feel, I think, of the Novablast 3. So yeah, it's a close call. My preference really sort of is ever so slightly for the Speed 3s based on that run, but we'll talk about more of that back in the office. So as I just mentioned, after doing that mile, the one thing that I found overall from my miles in these shoes is that there's not a huge amount of difference between them. There's not a great deal to choose for me between the ways these two shoes kind of ride. But overall, I personally find that you get a little bit more punch out of the Speed 3. I feel like that kind of speed roll technology, and because of the kind of compact nature of the shoe, you get a little bit more roll through than sort of your natural stride than you do with the slightly longer, to me, sort of boaty, canoey sort of Novablast 3. I think the length of it impacts that kind of roll through, at least it does for my stride. So if I'm choosing, I just think that there's a little bit more punch and power and response and roll and assistance that comes from the Speed 3. I do find the Novablast 3 still ever so slightly kind of softer and a little bit sinkier. It's not as bad as the 2. I think that's a vast improvement in this shoe, and I've enjoyed running in this shoe much more. But for me, I think there's a little bit more coming out the Speed 3. It depends, I think, largely if you're someone who maybe likes a slightly kind of firmer connected run than you might get with the Novablast 3. But again, I think we're talking margins here. When it comes to stability, I think there's marginally more stability coming out of the Speed 3 than the Novablast 3 at all kinds of paces, a range of paces on the corners. And again, I just think that comes down to that sort of slight softness versus the sort of slightly more firm ride that you get with the Saucony Endorphin Speed 3. Now, comfort. I really like both of these shoes, actually. I think they are both very, very comfortable shoes to run in. I feel like they hold the foot really nicely. I think your foot sits in them well. They're easy to lace up. They're good over longer miles as well. I had no problems going sort of deeper into sort of 2.5 hour runs with either of these two shoes. So kind of big fan. I don't think you're going to go wrong with that in terms of the overall comfort. What I think the difference here is, if you're making a choice, to me anyway, is that the Speed 3 just is a little bit more compact, a little bit more sort of nimble, a bit lighter and a bit more agile. It sort of hugs onto the foot, if you go true to size anyway, a little bit more than you find with the Novablast 3. I just think there's a little bit more kind of bagginess and a bit more kind of heft that goes on. It doesn't quite feel as disappearing, the Novablast 3, as the Speed 3 in my book, and I really love that kind of disappearing form. I'm just a little bit more aware that I'm wearing the Novablasts when they're on my feet. I don't think that's down to the weight necessarily. They are slightly heavier, but when you're out there moving, I'm not sure there's much to choose between that. I don't think that's too discernible. I just think it's really the length and the overall kind of, I guess the kind of slightly sort of bigger chunkiness of the Novablast 3 over the Speed 3. Durability, I don't think, again, there's going to be a great deal to choose between these. I think these shoes can both go for long my They are built very sturdy, built to last. The uppers on the Novablast 3 are not going anywhere fast. You know, all of this is kind of, the uppers are glued nicely to the midsoles. There's not going to be any kind of, that's not going to come apart. You can tell, you can just see it by looking at it. You know, there's maybe, you know, I think there's enough outsole rubber on here to be nice and protective on the Novablast 3. They may wear down after sort of 300-400 miles, but I think you're going to get at least that distance out of the shoe. I know for a fact from the Speed 3, because I've done it, you can get 650 miles out of a shoe like this. There's actually a video on the channel now where I've done a durability test. So again, in both of these, I think they'll be good investments and on offer good value for the money. Nothing really to choose between them. Let's have a quick chat about grip then. Good enough performance from both of these shoes. Again, I don't think there's an awful lot here to choose either. Even though you've got a sort of slightly smoother rubber on the Novablast 3, you know, both for me perform perfectly well in dry conditions. I don't think either of them are the grippiest shoes that you're going to find out there. And in both cases, when you sort of look at it, kind of manhole covers or metal drain covers and anything where it gets a little bit slippy, I sort of tend to be circumnavigating those things and avoiding them, because I don't think either of these sort of grip particularly well over those things. You know, if I'm splitting hairs, maybe in wet conditions, the Speed 3 just edged it overall on the grip. Now onto the verdict then, and I'm going to say that both of these shoes are very good shoes, and they can both do the job that they are billed as doing really quite well. They've both taken steps forward on previous generations. They're both really well made. I think you're getting good durability out of them, and I think they've got good range and versatility in terms of the types of kind of pace and terrain that you can run at in both shoes. And I think actually the choice here between the two shoes is largely going to come down to what your personal preferences are in terms of whether or not you like something that's ever so slightly softer, maybe a little bit more plush, maybe a little bit more overall comfort, you know, sort of saloon car, whereas I think the Speed 3 is a little bit more kind of stripped back, a little bit more kind of racy and a little bit more nimble, a little bit more agile. There's a little bit less shoe. It runs a little bit firmer as well than the Novablast 3. So I think it depends what you like. You know, if you're going to get that kind of, if you want a bit more cushion, you want a bit more kind of a sort of soft and sink and response, that I think the Novablast 3 are going to be for you. For me personally, I think the Speed 3 just edges it. This would be the one that I would sort of choose over and above. It is a little bit more expensive, but I just think it's got more range. I think it's more versatile. This is a shoe that I would happily do everything from very slow plods right up to kind of racing a marathon in. I just don't think that I would choose the Novablast 3 to race a marathon in. It's just a little bit too much shoe on the foot for my liking. And I just don't think it quite has that kind of upper sort of top pace kind of racing sort of skills in its locker that the Speed 3 does. So for me, I'd happily pay the extra sort of £30 or whatever it is for the Speed 3, and that would be my choice. Though I do think that some people will almost certainly prefer the Novablast 3 because of the other things that, you know, that slightly sort of plusher collar feel, that slightly softer ride. And I think, you know, it's fair to say that the Novablast 3 might actually be a shoe that sort of is a little bit better at the kind of lower end of the paces and your easy runs, you know, those kind of recovery runs than the Speed 3. So there you have it. That has been our head-to-head between the Saucony Endorphin Speed 3 and the ASICS Novablast 3, two new generations of two very popular shoes, two shoes that have been kind of favourites on the channel as well. If you have any questions about these shoes, hit us up in the comments below. We'll endeavour to answer them. If you've used both of these shoes or either of these shoes and you've got opinions, we want to hear them. How do you find them? Which one do you prefer? Which one would you race in? Which one do you think is better for the easy miles? Which one's got more versatility? Do you think we've got it all wrong? Maybe. Hit us up in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We're going to have lots more content coming up on the channel over the coming weeks. We'd love to get you to hear about that when it lands. So if you hit the bell, that'll kind of alert you when we've got new videos going up. Do that. Do it. Do it now. Probably just do it now, right now. There's loads of Speed 3 content on the channel as well, and there is a full review coming of the ASICS Novablast 3 from the multi-tester run testers. That'll be up soon. I'll stop waffling now. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about these shoes. Hope to see you again soon on the run testers.